Welcome to Social Psychology. I'm your professor, Ryan Keith. I appreciate you guys bearing with me while I'm out of town handling this family emergency. I'm going to do my best to provide a little bit of an audio lecture on top of my slides, flipping through them here, so that you can see the slides as I'd show them normally in class and hear some of the things I'd normally talk to when I deliver this lecture or we have this kind of a discussion. To be honest with you, I wouldn't want to sit and listen to myself talk for 2.5 hours like this. So this is going to be a somewhat briefer version. Let's consider it the abridged lecture on aggression. As you guys know, the motto for this class is why everyone's terrible, so you can imagine I could fill up numerous class periods discussing why it is we're aggressive and the ways that we're aggressive and how these things make us terrible, and in the end, really, how they're all natural, but I'll try to keep it under an hour this time around. So you can either flip along on your own slides if you've accessed them via the link on Canvas, or you can just watch this video here. This material is going to be on your next test, so you should treat this the same way that you would treat any lecture in class. Pay attention to the slides, take good notes, and try to make connections between this material and the other material that we've covered this semester. So, without further ado, let's talk about aggression. So as you can see, this isn't really just a lecture on aggression. It's a lecture on both aggression and altruism, and how both of these qualities are really two sides of the same coin, about how aggression and altruism serve each other, how they serve us, they help us be good people, and how they can help us be bad people too. As we talk about aggression and altruism and what these things are over this week and next week, we're going to talk not just about what they are, but why it is we experience these things. And as always, we're going to explore the main perspectives, the main models in the field of social psychology that explain these sorts of things, why it is we exhibit the behavior we do. Specifically, we're going to talk about the role of evolution, of economics, of culture, and of cognition in explaining why people act aggressively and altruistically. When we have a choice between doing something that might harm someone else or might help someone else, the evolutionary explanation, right, what it is we did a long, long time ago, contributes a lot to our understanding of why we make the choices we do. Similarly, the economic explanation, if you remember, that has to do with not just money, but trying to do as well as possible, and what we do when we do well, and what we do when we do poorly. This explains a lot of why we act aggressively and altruistically also. Something we haven't explored much beyond the role of independent and interdependent cultures is the role of culture. So we're going to talk about how people from different backgrounds, people from different cultures, make the choices to be aggressive or altruistic. If you guessed that being independent or interdependent might, or individualistic or collectivistic might play a role in this, you'd be right, but there's more to it than that. And last, we're going to talk about the role that cognition plays in making us aggressive or altruistic, that oftentimes when we decide to harm someone else for selfish reasons or help someone else for selfless reasons, that a lot of it comes down to how we understand that person and how we think about that person. So the first thing we can do in talking about these two sides of the same coin is to define them, as always. And in defining these two terms, aggression and altruism, we see that they really are polar opposites. If we're trying to determine these things in terms of what we call operational definitions, an operational definition is a very specific definition that can be used to conduct scientific work. If we're going to give a really operational definition, we see that these are real polar opposites in terms of behavior. We see that aggression is behavior intended to harm others for selfish and often for selfish reasons, right? And you notice that I put selfish in scare quotes there, the same way that when I talk about altruism, I say that altruism is behavior intended to help others for unselfish reasons. Again, I've got selfish and unselfish there in scare quotes, and you might guess that that's because not all aggressive behavior is entirely for selfish reasons. The same way that even though we think of altruism as being the height of goodness, the height of doing the right thing, that it might also be that when we think of doing something selfless, it's not really for entirely selfless reasons. One of the questions that we want to ask, and this is one of the reasons that I've got pictures of our closest ancestors up here, one of the questions we want to ask is why we resort to the kinds of behaviors that we do. Being social animals, both like chimpanzees on the left and bonobos on the right, we make use of these to maintain our status in our tribes, to make sure that we and our family members have what we need, but to make sure also that we can cooperate together and that we can support each other. I really like to have these specific pictures because these close ancestors, or I shouldn't say ancestors, but these close relatives of ours, chimpanzees and bonobos, they seem to really represent these choices between aggression and altruism. Chimpanzees, you can see there, he's got these really big teeth. Chimpanzees are violent animals that band together and they go to war against each other, and they'll fight each other to the death over territory. On the other hand, if we take a look at the bonobos on the right, you can see they tend to do a lot of sharing. Rather than the patriarchal, male-dominated, top-down society that chimpanzees have, bonobos tend to have a more matriarchal society. The women are in charge, and they solve their problems rather than fighting through sex, which is an interesting way to do it. Ask yourself which one of these groups you'd rather be in, and I think you come away with a pretty quick answer. I don't want to lead you into thinking, though, that altruism is always the right answer, because when we look at aggression and evolution, we tend to see specifically that, aggression, it holds a lot of answers for us. And one of the first things we can do in trying to explore why it is we might feel aggressive is to, rather than looking at what we would call immediate explanations for aggression in the long term, in this big evolutionary span of time, why are people aggressive, we could look at more, or rather than looking at those ultimate explanations, we could look at more immediate explanations. And in doing so, we find that social psychologists have defined different kinds of aggression. When we say, why are people aggressive, we can look at specific situations and see some different kinds of aggression that people display. The first kind of aggression that we can talk about is hostile or instrumental aggression. The choice between hostile and instrumental aggression is mostly driven by the situation. Being social psychologists, we're always going to talk about the situation. Hostile aggression refers to aggression that is simply for aggression's sake. When you get angry and you lash out at someone, that's hostile aggression. If somebody cuts you off in traffic and you get angry at them and you yell, you don't even have to engage with the person. You're expressing hostile aggression in that moment. If you're aggressive just because you're angry, because you're emotional, that's like you're getting angry because of that emotional brain driving things. That's hostile aggression. On the other hand, we also have instrumental aggression. Instrumental aggression it's not always necessarily cold, but it can be calculated. Instrumental aggression is aggression that we use to gain something else, especially social status. So instrumental aggression is that kind of aggression that you're not doing it just to be mean, you're doing it to get something else. So if we think about aggression being behavior intended to harm others, usually for selfish reasons. With hostile aggression, the focus is on the harm. You just want to harm others. Whereas instrumental aggression is more focused on that selfish reasons. That can include things, of course, like physically hurting somebody, but it could also involve stealing someone's stuff or doing something that makes it so that you can get a promotion instead of somebody else getting it, or you get a job instead of someone else getting it. You do well and you look good on the group project while somebody else really doesn't look as good. In this way, you can see that it's not just what it is that motivates this behavior that's different, but it's the behavior itself also. What's the difference between yelling at somebody and getting angry or even physically aggressing them as opposed to saying something mean behind their back? In this way, we can look at the two kinds of the two other ways that we can examine aggression, which is to categorize aggression as being either direct or relational. Sometimes relational aggression is also called indirect aggression. Direct aggression refers to aggression that we express directly toward another person. This, of course, can involve physical aggression, but also can involve verbal aggression. If you yell at somebody, if you get angry at them and you express that directly, that's direct aggression. Relational aggression involves making use of social connections to express aggression at another person. Every semester when I have a standard in-class discussion, there's a big argument about whether men or women tend to be more aggressive, right? It seems like we tend to split about 50-50. Half of us feel that men are more aggressive. The other 50 feel that women are more aggressive. In reality, we tend to see that men and women are equally aggressive. Just that in our culture, we tend to express this aggression in two different ways. Men tend to express direct aggression, especially toward each other, and women tend to express relational aggression. We'll explore a little bit why this is as we look at the different explanations for our behavior, but we tend to see a couple of different specific explanations. The evolutionary explanation would tend to tell us that direct aggression is normal, and women tend to rely on relational aggression because they are small and weak, and they're too busy being pregnant and carrying babies to look out for themselves, so they have to do things like talk about each other behind their backs to get what it is they need. In reality, we tend to see that this isn't exactly the case. Women, given the opportunity, will express direct aggression just as much as men will. Instead, what we tend to see is that a cultural explanation handles this better. That in our culture, if two boys get in a fight on a playground, of course they'll get in trouble, right? But ultimately, the dad will dust his boy off and ask if he's all right, and everybody will pretty much roll their eyes and shrug their shoulders and say, well, boys will be boys, right? In fact, if my son gets in a fight with somebody else's boy, as we walk away, I might tell that dad that he needs to control his son. He needs to look out for that kid, because if they get in a fight again, right, this time he's going to be really sorry. His boy's really going to be bleeding. I remember growing up, a lot of families had a rule, especially for their boys, that you don't start fights. But if somebody starts a fight with you, you sure as hell finish it, right? That in this implicit way, we're encouraging our boys to be, if not violent, at least directly aggressive, to look out for themselves. On the other hand, if two girls get in a fight, they face much stronger consequences. They're told that behavior is unladylike, that getting in a physical fight, that's not acceptable, that, you just bought your daughter a beautiful dress and she ruined it. In other words, she has no value other than her physical appearance, right? And that, in fact, for getting in a fight like that, you're going to invite over that little friend they just got in a fight with, and they're going to sit down and have tea or have lunch and get along. And if you've ever been in a fight with somebody, you know that doesn't happen. You're not going to sit down and get along with this person. You know that your parents taught you that physical aggression, direct aggression, is not acceptable, so you find another way to deal with it. You might freeze somebody out, right? They come over and try to sit down and talk with you and your friends, and you all ignore them. You might spread rumors. You might talk about somebody behind their back. You might come up with a rude nickname for the person. And as you guys know, social media has allowed us to develop a plethora of new kinds of relationally aggressive mechanisms, whether we're talking about posting a passive-aggressive comment on somebody's Facebook feed or subtweeting about them on Twitter. It's, not fantastic when it comes to cyberbullying, but as far as social psychologists are concerned, it offers a whole new way to examine problematic behaviors. So again, what I want you guys to try to do when we examine these kinds of differences, things between like men and women, let's not jump to our first conclusions, but instead try to consider, why is it that things exist the way they are, and is the explanation really what we think it is? Speaking of explanations, right, the slide is a little awkward. I'm not sure why it comes up exactly the way it does, but again, just a reminder, kind of like we talked about at the top of the slides, whether we're discussing overt, hostile, direct aggression, or more subtle, instrumental, relational aggression, we can always consider both these immediate causes like we discussed a second ago, and more ultimate causes in identifying why we act the way we do. I want to frame aggression in terms of how we used to do these things a long time ago, evolutionarily. How doing bad can actually help us do well, economically. How our aggressive behavior is influenced by the culture we operate in, and how it's a result of the way we think about the world. So let's start way back at the beginning and consider how aggression could have helped our great grandparents in the evolutionary explanation. By the way, I have this picture mostly because I just absolutely love it. And the idea that, evolution is what drives aggression is this really, in some ways, attractive perspective that if we look at aggression like we talk about with anything in the evolutionary perspective, the underpinning explanation is that these problems we face today aren't really problems at all. They're just adaptations for a different environment, right? And so if we're talking about adaptations for a different environment, we need to ask ourselves how aggression used to help us. In order to examine how aggression used to help us, we need to think about how things used to be, not 100 years ago, or 500 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, or 2,000 years ago, but how things used to be 40 or 50,000 years ago. We're talking about, like, if you go back 100 years, you get to the sinking of the Titanic. If you go back 200 years, you get kind of close to the signing of the Declaration of Independence and our war for independence. If you go back 2,000 years ago, specifically 2017 years ago at the recording of this audio, you get to the point where, Jesus, J-Man, was like walking the earth, right? That's a long time ago. If you think about how we depict the way that Jesus and his followers lived there, incredibly different from how we live today. And then I want you to do that like 25 more times. That's the situation we're talking about. We're talking about people who lived in a society immensely different from ours, but who, as we talked about earlier this semester, possessed exactly the same kind of brain that we have now. And this brain is built for solving problems in a certain way, and that way isn't always good for us. If we look at the environment where people used to operate, we're talking about, and again, social environment, right? Of course, we lived in environments that were different. We didn't have the kinds of technology we do now, the kind of shelter we do now. We definitely didn't have the abundant resources we do. But societally, we're talking about these very small, related, similar tribes. These are things I want you to know, that we operated in tribes that were very small. When I talk about small, I'm talking about like your entire social psych class. That's everyone you know. And I don't just mean like for a day or a year. I'm talking about everyone you will ever meet your entire life. That's your social psychology class. We're talking like 24 people. And that's a pretty sizable group of people. When you consider that you've got 24 people and that's it, everybody's going to be related to each other because there aren't a whole lot of people to get busy with. So everyone's going to be related. And if you're all related and you spend all this time around each other, you're going to be similar in pretty much every way there is to be similar, whether we're talking physically, culturally, or mentally. You'll communicate the same. You'll think the same. You'll even look the same. When we think about that, it starts to explain some of these things we've talked about before, like intergroup aggression, right? Where groups tend to be aggressive with each other, or we're more likely to be aggressive with people who look different from us. We talk about xenophobia, this fear of people who are different from us, right? This stuff all has to do with this fact that we operate in these small, similar tribes. These tribes also tended to be local in the sense that everyone you see is right there. You don't read on the news about people being accosted in these far-off locations. So if somebody's getting hurt and you hear about it, they're probably really close to you. And these societies are strongly hierarchical, not necessarily all that different from how we are today, but this is something that's important. You want to protect your social standing. So when we look at how aggression used to help us, we can look at a couple of things like inclusive fitness and group selection. The idea of group selection is kind of like the idea of natural selection. When you've heard of natural selection before, right? So like evolution through natural selection, you think of survival of the fittest. Inclusive fitness and group selection both pretty much mean survival of the fittest group. That it's not the individual who does well, but it's our group that does well. That if we work together, we create a successful group that fits well in the environment, and that's what's likely to do well. And if we look at this at the situations today that tend to make people aggressive, it kind of lines up with how we would help our group survive and help ourselves survive within these groups. A couple of things socially that make us more likely to be aggressive are if we are provoked. You think about provocation. If somebody cuts in front of you in line, if somebody insults you, if somebody acts like they're blowing you off, like you can think back to your book's description of various emotions, and if somebody expresses contempt to you, they sneer, right? They scoff, they make that noise that pff, or that kind of noise that says that they don't really care about you. I mean, that's the sort of thing that really shouldn't affect you in the big scheme of things, but it makes us want to feel aggressively because in these small, strongly hierarchical groups, if we ignored that, we'd be knocked down a few pegs in the hierarchy. And if somebody could treat you that way, then maybe everyone could treat you that way, and they could take away your food, they could take away your mates, they could take away your weapons, they could take away your shelter. If we look at complementarity, Complementarity is something we talked about at the very beginning of the semester, but this is the idea that we tend to mirror other people's behavior. When other people act aggressively, the best solution today usually is to try to get them to calm down, but a long time ago, if somebody was acting aggressively, they might actually kill you. So we tend to fall back on these old evolutionary roots and also act aggressively towards them. Complementarity, we tend to mirror each other's behavior. Jealousy is a really big deal for us. If you think about your reaction, if you catch your significant other admiring someone else in the mall or at a store or even on TV, most of us are going to feel pretty upset, right? You're going to feel skeeved out if you catch them looking at somebody on their phone, even though you know full well they're not really going to run away. Like you're going to step into the dressing room in the Hollister or the Banana Republic and come out and they've started a family with someone new. So why are we jealous? And we're jealous because a long time ago, if they were checking somebody out, it would be one of those 24 people that you're going to be around your whole life, and you're more likely to want to be aggressive and stop that from happening, because in that real way, you could go off hunting, you could go off gathering, come back, and someone else is hanging out in your cave. A couple of other things that tend to produce aggression on this very basic physical level are both discomfort and frustration. If you're not comfortable, for example, if you're hot in the summer, there tends to be more aggressive behavior, or if you're frustrated because things aren't going your way, you're more likely to lash out and act aggressively. Discomfort is the sort of thing you get when you don't have a lot of stuff, like when your tribe's in danger and you don't have much food. So if you're hungry, you're frustrated, you're uncomfortable, you tend to be aggressive. So in this way, we can ask ourselves, aggression used to help us a long time ago for us to protect ourselves and protect our tribes. Can aggression still help us today? Well, what we tend to see is that situations that in a direct way mirror what we experienced a long time ago, you're in danger, a family member's in danger, there is a threatening person around, aggression can help us. If you're in a situation where somebody is threatening you and people you care about, aggression can help you. But if you really think about how often those sorts of situations come about, you'll find that the honest answer is not very often, especially in standard civilian life. How necessary is aggression as a choice for most people? We'd have to say really not very helpful. And in fact, when we look at our operations, on a day-to-day basis, more often than not, we find that aggression hurts us today. That we can look at things like road rage and crime, and in terms of relational aggression, things like unethical behavior, that for the most part, aggression isn't helpful. And if we look at xenophobia adapted today, we tend to see intergroup aggression. So intergroup is kind of like interstate. It's between groups. Intergroup aggression is this common aggression that we see between social groups, whether we're talking across ethnic lines, across class lines, across national lines, or even just across college football lines. We tend to see that the existence of two groups tends to produce aggression between these two groups, right? So when we look at this, right, like evolutionary explanation, part of it is this just so story of what the world used to be like, but it's also an explanation based on looking at our biology. We've talked about this a little bit before. This picture of the brain is a lot better than the picture of the brain that I tend to draw, but it's mostly to illustrate the kind of two different brains that you operate. If you've ever heard this phrase, to be of two minds about something, it means that it's like you have a hard time deciding. It's almost like you've got two different brains. You really want one thing, but you know that you shouldn't have it. And what we tend to see is that when we look at your brain, there really are two minds here. That when we look at these evolutionary explanations for our behavior, it's not just a story. It's also based on the fact that we carry these eons of neurological baggage with us. When you look at a picture of your brain, like this one here, right, and I can kind of highlight, I think I've got a pointer that'll work here, you can see that the brain both ontogenically, so this in the individual, and phylogenetically within the species, develops from the bottom up. So like these arrows go, that within the individual when you're developing in the womb, but also going back in evolutionary time, the spinal cord is the oldest part of your brain. It's the earliest developed. And all the way up here where you think rationally up in the front, right? This is the newest part of your brain. It's the last part to develop in a person. If you take my developmental psychology class, we talk a lot about this, but it's also evolutionarily the newest, most powerful part of your brain. And when we look at the ways that we make decisions, this limbic system deep in the center of your brain right here, this is where we make emotional decisions. It's what psychologists and other scientists call your lizard brain. And when we look way up at the front, this is something called the prefrontal cortex, or the PFC. The prefrontal cortex is about making rational decisions. It's about planning, and most importantly, it's about controlling yourself. And when we look at the situations that are likely to produce aggression, there are situations that either amplify the functioning of the limbic system, they produce fear, they make you angry, or there are situations that tend to shut down the prefrontal cortex. For example, if we look at age, children are more likely to be aggressive and directly aggressive than adults are. Their prefrontal cortices aren't particularly well developed. If you're hungry, you don't tend to have as much energy for driving your power-hungry prefrontal cortex. You're more likely to be aggressive. One of the areas of your brain that gets impacted first by the imbibing of alcohol is your prefrontal cortex. You're more likely to be aggressive when you've been drinking. Ego depletion. Exercising self-control, like we talked about at the beginning of the semester, exercising self-control makes it difficult for you to continue exercising more self-control. Running that prefrontal cortex, you're more likely to act aggressively, right? Now, this comes down to, it comes down not just to how we function in terms of our brains, but also in terms of how we function in terms of our other biology. I talked about how men and women tend to function a little bit differently, right? And there is an explanation, something called the precarious manhood hypothesis, that connects both biology and culture and explaining why men tend to be more aggressive than others. The idea of the precarious manhood hypothesis, referring to other biology, is that a man's masculinity in our culture is a real central part of how he values himself. The manlier a guy is, the better he is. But also that sense of masculinity is highly variable. It can change, and it's not very hard to make it change. And when a man feels threatened in terms of his masculinity, he's more likely to act aggressively. So if somebody reminds you, for example, that their truck is bigger than yours, and you know what I mean by truck, you're more likely to be aggressive, to try to express violence to protect that sense of masculinity. So, stepping away from biology, precarious manhood hypothesis, somebody threatens your masculinity, you'll be aggressive. Stepping away from biology and evolution, let's talk just a little bit about economics and how economics make us act and feel aggressive. What we tend to see in the economic explanation is that aggression, especially instrumental aggression, is used as a means to increase our benefits over our costs, to get more of what we need. And that when we look at hostile aggression, that's mostly a result of a perceived scarcity of resources. So when we look at this stuff, we can see that a couple of main things come into play here, that specifically social comparisons tend to produce a lot of aggression. I could ask you, like I would in class, what kind of social comparison is most likely to produce aggression, and we would see that upward social comparisons do that. Upward comparisons, you compare yourself to somebody who's doing better than you, you want to feel aggressive because instrumental aggression will help you get more, and that kind of direct aggression is a way to express your upsettedness at not having as much as they do. And this leads to another important term when it comes to economics, something that sociologists, not just psychologists, call relative deprivation. You see, when we talk about poorness, there are two kinds of deprivation we can refer to. One is called absolute deprivation. The other is relative deprivation. Absolute deprivation refers to being absolutely poor. When you have so little money that you can't feed your family, you can't clothe your family, you're dying of starvation in the streets, that is absolute deprivation. But we often see that people suffering from absolute deprivation, they aren't as upset as we would expect for being as poor as they are. In fact, in many cases, they're not as upset as people who are poor in the United States. We think about that like first world poor where, you may not have a lot of money, but you have a car and a phone, right? You're not dying in the streets, but you're upset about how poor you are. And the reason we may be upset about how poor we are, even though we're wealthy in terms of like global wealth, is because of this thing called relative deprivation, that we feel deprived relative to other people around us. It's not how poor you are in the global scheme of things. It's the fact that it's very easy for you to see how poor you are compared to other people. In fact, when we look at that, it explains a lot of the aggression that we see, that in nations that are just absolutely poor, we don't necessarily see tons of aggression, especially between group members in these nations. But when we look in a place like the United States, we tend to see that income inequality, so differences in income at the level of the nation, the state, the county, or even just the neighborhoods that have different levels of income, these things strongly predict aggression of just about every kind. That when we look at violence in neighborhoods, right, we tend to see a lot of violence in poor neighborhoods, but a lot of that violence is not a result of that neighborhood being poor. It's the fact that that poor neighborhood is near a wealthy neighborhood. And you might ask yourself then, right, like, well, if living in a poor neighborhood produces violence, then why don't we see more violence from poor people toward wealthy people, right? And that's because this gets down to very deep stuff. It's not just that you're sitting there calculating, saying, I'm poor and they're wealthy and I want that car and I want that house and I want that stereo. You feel upset and you feel angry and you feel poor and you want something. And so maybe you lash out in this direct, hostile, aggressive way. Or maybe you plan to steal something, but not necessarily from the wealthy person who lives, down the road, across the street, across the tracks. If we wanted to look from a social psychology perspective at the number one thing that would reduce aggressive behavior in the United States, it would be to reduce income inequality at all of these levels, at the nation, at the state, at the county, at the city, even within neighborhoods. So talking about these really big explanations of what it is that produces aggression, of course, leads us to talking about cultural explanations for aggression. And when we talk about our culture, we notice something interesting. We notice that aggression is something that we talk about from even a really long time ago, that we see in our culture, especially in this very Anglo-oriented, coming from the British Isles culture, that stuff like dueling to solve our problems is something that we see from, using swords, to much later using pistols, to even dueling with the most advanced of technology. And in that way, we can see that culture in this big way influences how we think we need to solve our problems. And in looking at cultural explanations, right, if we look at our cultural explanations here, we see a few main things pop up. The first is collectivism versus individualism. I'm going to pop over this, pretty quickly. When talking about collectivism versus individualism, it's kind of like talking about men versus women. A lot of people, if you look at the data, would tend to draw the conclusion that collectivistic cultures, those members of those cultures don't tend to act aggressively. What we tend to see is that people from collectivistic cultures from Eastern Asia, from South America, from pretty much everywhere that's not the UK and former British colonies, they're simply more likely to make use of instrumental relational aggression, where those of us who are from individualistic backgrounds tend to be more directly aggressive. This is one explanation for why we have so much gun violence in the United States. It's not just about the kinds of crime that we have. It turns out other countries have just as much crime as the United States have. We simply have more lethal crime. One argument is that we have the implements to make that possible. The other explanation is that being an individualistic background, we're more likely to look at this kind of hostile direct aggression as being an acceptable way to vent our problems. Another explanation tied in with that kind of background comes from this thing called a culture of honor. Your book tries to explain this, but does so kind of clumsily and poorly. The idea of a culture of honor is that particular cultures, individuals from particular cultures, like from the rural South, from Appalachia, are likely to react particularly strongly to perceived slights against them. So somebody being rude makes you more likely to want to react aggressively, especially violently toward other people. And what we tend to see is that people, especially from rural backgrounds, from the American South, from Appalachia, are likely to do this. Again, your book explains this somewhat clumsily, but what we think is going on is that when we look at why people from these regions are likely to act aggressively, it has to do with cultural trends that go back hundreds of years. That the people, following Native Americans, when Europeans came to the United States, the Europeans who settled in especially Appalachia, were people who lived in these similar kinds of like rocky, low hill, mountainous, kind of terrains in the UK, and those people tended to be like Scottish Highlanders. And the people who lived in Scotland and in the northern British Isles, they survived rather than based on agriculture. If you look in the deep south and along the eastern coast, there was a lot of big agriculture, right, growing of crops. The people who grew up in Appalachia, again, this area of this culture of honor where you have feuds and fights between families, they survived by herding the same way they did in the UK. And one of the things you get growing up in a herding family is that it's very easy to lose everything. It's really hard for someone to roll up on your corn farm or your wheat farm and steal all your corn or wheat, but it's really, really easy for somebody to like come up with nothing more than like a stick and a dog and take all of your sheep or all of your cattle or all of your goats, and your livelihood is gone. And for that reason, like anybody who seems to be a very small threat could really represent a very big threat, right? So the culture of honor is simply that people who come from these kinds of backgrounds where honor is a really big deal, perceived threats are a really big deal, they're more likely to react really strongly if they feel that they've been threatened or that their family has been threatened in some way. One of the last things we can talk about is about viewing aggression. That this idea that viewing aggression, like in the media or in individuals, tends to lead to more aggressive behavior. There is a lot of hot discussion right now about whether violent media produces violent behavior. And you may feel strongly one way or the other, but I'd ask you to look at the data. We talked at the beginning of the semester about Albert Bandura and the Bobo doll experiment and what we saw with kids there. We also tend to see, for example, that children who are exposed to corporal punishment, that's physical punishment, are more likely to become abusive spouses and abusive parents themselves. This doesn't mean that if you grew up in the rural South like me, or your parents made use of corporal punishment, that you're going to become an abusive person. It doesn't mean that if you spanked your kids once, they're going to be bad. It simply means that if kids view this kind of problem-solving behavior, they're more likely to fall back on it in the future, to feel in a very basic way that this is maybe how you get someone to do what you want. You use violence to make them do that stuff. So again, I know I'm skipping over this stuff pretty quickly, but I just wanted to say, really that our culture is a big part of why we do what we do. And in the same way that evolution, in this long-term sense, makes us act aggressively, so does our culture. So we see the same sort of thing when we look at how we think about the world, that when we're acting aggressively, right, in this immediate term, when we're acting aggressively, we tend to think a lot like this guy we see in the background, the chimpanzee. And when we look at this, right, we tend to see that our aggression affects the way that we construe situations. We fall back on certain kinds of biases. When we act aggressively, we fall back on simplistic reasoning, and we tend to respond differently to punishments and reinforcements. I might skip over that last point a little bit since I just hit it, but let's kind of see where we go. First of all, if we talk about construal biases, you'll remember construals refer to the conclusions we draw based on our schemas, how we think about the world. And when we're acting aggressively towards somebody, this is kind of the unfortunate negative feedback loop we get in. Think about any argument you've ever been in. Once you start to be in an argument, once somebody criticizes you or says that you're wrong, it makes it really hard to back down and shut that down and start to think about them. Because once we start to act aggressively or think aggressively about someone who's in another group, is in the out group, we tend to distance ourselves from those people. I want you to know distancing is a thing that we do. And once we distance ourselves from them, that makes further aggression more possible, because once they're in the out group, once they're one of them, it makes it really easy to dehumanize that person. If we think about the way that we talk about the enemies of our nation, we don't talk about them as if they are people. We don't talk about them as individuals who are maybe the result of a really unfortunate situation. We talk about them as less than people, as these enemies who don't deserve to live. When we talk about the people who we're afraid of, who we're angry at, we don't talk about them the way we talk about our family members or our friends. We talk about them as being less than human. That is dehumanizing them. We also tend to fall prey to something, and watch people in arguments, watch people that you're in arguments with, and you'll see this. If you watch yourself, you'll see it too, that once we start to be in an argument with somebody, or you engage with somebody that you identify as part of an out-group, we tend to fall prey to something called reactive devaluation. Reactive devaluation. What reactive devaluation means is that when you identify somebody as being an opponent to yourself, they're somebody who you need to be aggressive to, you will reactively look at their ideas, look at their solutions as being less valuable, not as a result of the idea itself, but because of who it comes from, right? If you and your brother fight all the time, he may come up with a really good explanation for something, but you're more likely to shoot it down just because it comes from your brother. Now, of course, I didn't come up with that explanation because I've been dealing with my brother for the past 3 days, but this is something that we see in other people, and if you look carefully, you'll also see it in yourself, right? And when we look at these unfortunate situations we end up in, right? Not only are we more likely to shut things down, but when you get angry, you're also more likely to fall prey to simplistic reasoning. That rather than sitting down and thinking in a complex way, like you would with that advanced prefrontal cortex, you're more likely to think with that lizard brain, that emotional brain. It's us versus them. They're threatening me. We can't come to a complex conclusion that makes everyone happy. When you're feeling aggressive, you're more likely to look for an easy, simple solution that makes other people lose and you win. In this way, this cognitive explanation, it ties together the evolutionary explanation, the economic explanation. People from a culture of honor, if we talk about culture, are more likely to do this when they feel threatened. And the result then is that all of this comes together to make us more likely to escalate group conflict rather than find a common ground for everybody. That once we end up in conflict, these groups tend to misperceive the other side as being extremist, even though we're making ourselves more extreme, and we tend to then overestimate our differences, to dehumanize these people, and to assume, right, even though we're acting in a hostile way, to assume that the other side is motivated by hostility rather than understanding maybe the situation that they come from, right? And this is that self-serving attributional bias and fundamental attribution error that we talked about at the very beginning of the semester. When we look at what it is that helps us shut down hostile interactions, and I mean, not to sound all hippy-dippy, but the world would be a better place if we practice this more. What if, rather than aiming to entirely destroy our opponents, we found a way for everyone to be happy? The way to do this is to really simply encourage complex reasoning. The more complex reasoning you do, the more problem solving you do, the more you're forced to interact with others to solve these problems, the more you have to bring in evidence and integrate ideas together, the more you get away from that lizard brain and you get up in the prefrontal cortex and you start to look at other people as being people. The more you encourage communication, and I know it might sound silly that and it sounds cliche that if you want to solve a problem, you need to end up locked in a room with the person. Like when we look at a romantic comedy and the two people end up stuck in an elevator and they resolve their problems together. Being stuck with another person, having to fall back on constructive communication, we tend to see that this kind of constructive communication is a key way that we resolve our problems. So, I think that is enough for our discussion of aggression. When we get back together next week, we will talk about the flip side of this and about how we make use as much of aggression. We also make use of altruism. One of the reasons I talk about aggression coming from this big, broad background is that it's something that's built into us. Aggression, racism, discrimination, intergroup conflict, violence, this is really hard to get rid of because it's baked into our genes, it's baked into our culture, it's baked into the way we think. But there is a silver lining, and that's that when we talk about why we're not just focused on hurting each other, but also when we're focused on helping each other, that comes from a similarly genetic, biological, baked-in kind of a background. I'll be back in town normally for next week. I know it's a short week, but I'll look forward to talking a little bit about the good story in our project moving forward. In the meantime, if you have questions, please let me know, shoot me an email, and I'll look forward to talking to you about why we do not terrible things, but also the terrible reasons we do those not terrible things. I'm Ryan Keith. This is Social Psychology. Thank you for watching and listening.